Professor Patricia Wiltshire is a unique forensic ecologist, one of the only ones in the world. She's worked on over 300 criminal cases, and she's been involved in some of the most high-profile murders, including the murder of Sarah Payne and the Soham murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. She's worked with every police force in the UK, and her days spent at crime scenes collecting samples and standing over dead bodies in mortuaries or searching for graves and hidden remains has led her to the solution of some of the worst crimes imaginable. She's the author of two books, Traces and this one, The Natural History of Crime, Case Studies in Death and Clues that Nature Leaves Behind. So, Patricia Wiltshire, thank you very much for joining me today. Can I say this is one of the most remarkable books I've read. I read quite a lot of books, and I've got an extensive library, rather like you, but maybe not as large. But I have to say, it's one of the most fascinating and discursive books I've come across. It's very well written, and it's also one which sort of draws you in. It's based upon a number of particular cases which you've done, but it takes you down many little by alleys and side routes, which just fill in a whole range of different interests and information, which I've gained a lot just from reading it. So, tell me, how did you come? Can we start off by asking you, how did you come to take up this very unusual occupation of being a forensic ecologist? And how did you learn the methods and techniques of doing this particular work?
Oh gosh, it's a huge jigsaw puzzle, really. How did I come up to, well, I trained ostensibly as a botanist, but I just studied as many things as I could possibly do. And I was very lucky to be an undergraduate at King's College London in the early days. And we had the most wonderful people there, the most encouraging people. And whatever I wanted to do, I seemed able to do. If I wanted to do biogeography or parasitology or so, I was allowed to do it. And I just was such a workaholic because I went to university as a mature student. I was 28 instead of 18, and I'd already had two careers, if you like, before that. And I just enjoyed myself. I just enjoyed myself the whole time. And it took me down so many different avenues. And I think I'm one of those people that I can't resist things. If something's interesting, it doesn't know. I love doing crochet and craft work, and I love painting, and I love gardening, and I love other things that my friends do. And I'm just fascinated by all sorts of things. And I think to be an ecologist, you have to have a very special technique. And mine is in botany, I suppose, and palynology, which is the study of pollen, spores, and lots of microscopic things that you find on your microscope slide. But
But some of the, I have to say,
sorry.
some of the things that you have to learn are very, very specific to the forensic element, the idea of bodies being found in ground where they've been decayed for a long time. All of those, I would have thought, are not commonly taught in universities, are they?
No, they're not. I mean, what happened was I eventually, after 18 years, I left King's College and I went to University College. And I was working as a botanist palynologist in archaeology, which again is fascinating. I met so many interesting people and was exposed to so many interesting things. And I've actually worked in Pompeii and on Hadrian's Wall. And I did the groundwork for Terminal 5 at
Wow.
Heathrow. And a whole beautiful landscape came because through looking at plant remains and pollen and spores, the deeper you go down in any sediment, the further back in history you're going.
Yeah.
If you can identify what's there in layers and quantify it, you can work out how things are changing. And you can reconstruct at any one point in that profile, you can reconstruct what it was like at that horizon, at that layer, but you can keep going and you can see how it changes. Now, there are all sorts of caveats there because, of course, sediments don't accumulate uniformly. And although you say, yes, depth means time, that accretion of sediments is variable. So you can't draw a straight line and say, you know, this is 100 BC and this is 500 AD. You can't do that sort of thing. It has to be done with radiocarbon dating and calibrated and so on. But that's another story, actually.
Yeah.
But
But much of this you've had to teach yourself, haven't you? I mean, I get the impression that many of these techniques you've developed methods, you've developed your own processes, you've had to learn on the job.
Yes, well, I learned how to do palynology and so on at King's College, and I taught it as well. And I used it at University College. But of course, when I was in archaeology, I was faced with circumstances or with deposits that the standard techniques didn't address. So I'd have to think, how can I get around this, you know? And I'd invent my own. And it was well, one classic example was in Colchester, where a wonderful archaeologist there called Philip Crummie, he had excavated what everybody was calling a druidic tomb. And a druid doctor had been buried, and they used to cover, this is how Hadrian's Wall was built as well. They used to cover tombs with turf. So you would have sod to sod, grass to grass, earth to earth, grass to grass, and it's very durable and protective. And that's how Hadrian's Wall was built originally. And parts of it are still there. And once they'd excavated that away, if you think about it, if you've got grass, if you've got upside down profiles, if I go through that, I've got a whole series of little profiles that are upside down on each other. So I went carefully through that and was able to show that Colchester at the turn of the millennium, which is when it was just before the Romans had come, was more open than it is today. Fewer trees, there were cornfields and so on. But what was interesting is all the artifacts in the tomb. And one of these archaeologists were calling a wine strainer, and it had a chunk of crud. I call it crud, I don't know what else to call it, rubbish, stuck in the spout. And the archaeologist was treasuring this bit of rubbish. And he said, can you help me? Can you help me? He had scanning electron microscopy done on it and so on. And I said to him, Philip, if you don't let me destroy a little bit of that, you'll never know what it is. So he bit the bullet and he let me do it. And lo and behold, the most magical thing came out. First of all, it was full, stuffed with Artemisia pollen. That's mugwort pollen. Then it had pollen of all the sorts of plants that you know that bees visit to get nectar, the so-called bee attractive plants. And I suddenly realized, you see, mugwort is related to wormwood. And it's medicinal. And wormwood is used for getting rid of intestinal worms. Now, he was possibly using mugwort, and perhaps that does too, getting rid of intestinal worms. But wormwood is bitter as anything. So what was he doing? He was putting honey in it. You see? And when I envisaged this and showed the archaeologist the graphs I'd produced and my ideas, he was thrilled to bits. And he said, well, yes, that's it. And so that was, oh dear, my dog has just come in. It's all right, Ruby, it's all right. She wants to meet you. She's a rescue dog from Romania. I've only had her 3 years. Wow. And she was very strange, but now she's wonderful. So I have got this. I'm sorry, Philip. I'm going to have to put her out because,
that's all right. Don't worry about it. If you need to put her out, that's fine. We can cut a little bit out here if you need to. But whatever makes you feel more comfortable. Yeah,
she just wanted to see what was going on.
That's all right.
I might have to go and get a drink of water because my throat goes a bit funny. But anyway, I I'd done this off the top of my head, and the results I thought were wonderful, and so did the archaeologist. And that I suppose would be an approach you would use in forensic science. And one day, and I can't remember whether it was 1993 or 1994, I got a phone call, and it was a very tough sounding Glaswegian police officer. And he said that they'd been to Kew Gardens for help, but there was nobody there that could help them. But Kew Gardens said that I could. So he should come to me. So he did. And I said, well, how can I help you? And he said, well, we've got a murder. And
This was the first case. Am I right? The
yeah,
first
the
one. Yeah.
very
That's
first
how it
one.
all started. Yes.
Yes, it all started. And I think I've outlined all this in my first book. And I didn't even know what a sergeant, an inspector or anything was. I knew nothing about the police. And so they said, would you come and look? He said, we have this car and we're pretty sure this was the villain's car. And we want to prove we want to see whether or not it had been in this field. So I said, okay. I'd never looked at a car, I'd never done anything. But I went to look at this car and I just took it to bits and I analysed just about everything that might have picked up pollen, spores, and botanical remains, anything, everywhere. I just did everything on it. And believe you me, the radiator of a car is so full of stuff you can't imagine. And I remember soaking it in bowls of hot soapy water. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I found that the footwells and the foot pedals, when I looked at the pollen and spores, the habitat just jumped out at me straight away. And I had seen this habitat in archaeology many times. And it was an ancient hedge, and it was a field boundary. And I could see the hedge, I could see the species in the hedge, I could see the species at the field boundary. And I said to the police, well, this has definitely been in a field. And they said, would you like to see the field? And I said, yes. And when I got there, they said, we'll show you where the body was. And I said, look, can I test myself? Can I just see if I can recognize the place from my palynological, that's the pollen profiles. So it was a huge field and we walked in up the hedge. No. And I was getting disappointed. But what I had noticed is that there was a wheat field opposite the site, about several hundred yards away. Anyway, I eventually came to a spot, and what I saw under my microscope was there. And I said, well, to me, that's the place. That is the place. And the police nearly fell over, and they said, well, that's where the body was. And that pleased me so much, because what it showed me was what I had been seeing in archaeology. I was reasonably accurate much of the time. And if you can imagine, when you're working in the past, like archaeology, you're looking through the thick end of a bottle. You can never prove it. You can only put two and two together and put it all together like a jigsaw puzzle and surmise. But here I had the proof. And I could see that what I had envisaged was there. And that evidence, the evidence that I provided, because I didn't know anything about the case really, and the story of it came out later, helped the police get a conviction. And it was a Chinese triad gang.
And amazing what you come across. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I can tell you the story, but it's in the book.
Yeah. I have to say that one thing which struck me very forcefully when I was reading through your book is how similar the process that you go through was to Sherlock Holmes. I mean, he must have been probably the first forensic scientist in fiction, of course, but his tools and techniques of looking at things, he didn't go into the fine detail of grains, spores, fungi, and those kind of things. But nevertheless, the approach that you take reminded me that you are like a sort of a modern day updated Sherlock Holmes, going into a scene and discovering things which most people cannot and would never see for themselves.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because I once had a police officer come all the way from North Wales, two of them. They always go in pairs, by the way, police officers.
Yeah.
And he sat in my breakfast room there with a cup of tea. And I said, "Oh, you're a rugby player. You've got two cats. One is a ginger Tom and one is a tortoiseshell female."
Wow.
And he looked at me as though I was a witch. And he said, "How on earth could you know that?" And it's just common sense. It's just common sense. If you looked at his physique, first of all, he was Welsh, that helped. But if you looked at his, it was the physique of a rugby player. And he could either have been a rower or a rugby player, big shoulders, you know, strong thighs. His trousers were covered in skags, little skags. The fabric just pulled. And there were hairs on his trousers. Some were ginger and some were mottled. Now, I know that most ginger cats, it's very rare to get a ginger female. They do exist, but it was more likely to be a ginger Tom. Tortoiseshell cats are nearly always female. You do get very rare males, but they're a bit odd. Genetically, they're odd. And I saw the hairs of a tortoiseshell cat and a ginger cat. You put two and two together. And it was just simple deduction. And of course, it makes you look as though you were a clairvoyant, but it was just common sense.
Well, it's exactly the effect that Sherlock Holmes had when he explained that what his observations were. They always said, "Oh, that's obvious," and he
It's
said,
obvious.
"Sometimes I think I shouldn't have explained it, and I'd still maintained my reputation."
Well, this is, yeah, there are such things are just obvious. All it means is that I need you to have known a little bit about cats.
Yeah.
And having to wash and iron clothes, be aware that his trousers had all these skags on them, which irritated me no end. My husband does things like that. It irritates me. So, you know.
You also had to learn a lot about an area which most people never come in contact with, which is the dead bodies, decomposing bodies. I don't think I've ever in my entire life, and I've been around for over 60 years now, ever seen a dead body at all. But you must come across it so frequently and intimately know the various different facets of it that you can draw deductions from it. You mentioned something called a body farm. Can you tell me how you learned about that aspect of it through body farms in Knoxville, I believe?
Yes, well, of course, there is at least 6 now in America. There's one in Canada. We haven't got any it's not allowed in Britain. We've been trying to get one in Britain. There's one in Australia.
Well, what are they?
Well, basically, people give their bodies. They're laid out in different conditions and you just watch them rot.
They're laid out in the open, are they?
Well, it depends. I mean, in Knoxville, it's been there for very many years now. They lay them out. They put them in cars. They put them in water. They'll bury them. They'll turn them upside down. They do all sorts of things because these are the conditions that you might find corpses in a crime. And they just watch them rot. Well, of course, the dilemma comes that Knoxville is very warm, very humid, a certain soil. So what you see there, essentially, you can't extrapolate to, say, Canada or Siberia or to Spain or whatever, because those conditions are quite specific. So the process of rotting there might not be the same because of climatic conditions, and also the different sorts of animals that are there, the different species of fly and so on. What they don't have there, which they keep out, are scavengers. Because
Yeah.
you see, they don't, it's got a fence all the way around it. So they don't allow scavengers. And there's really, can you ever make a predictive model through looking at corpses rotting? Yes, you can say certain things, but there have been schemes like after so many days, this will happen, after so many days, that will happen, at this temperature, that will happen, and so on. But that's that one set of conditions. Will you get exactly those conditions in another location? who knows? And I think people have gone off a lot of people have gone off the idea a bit of body farms, because they don't call them body farms they call them the facilities. I've got an open mind, really. They've an enormous amount has been learned from them. There's no doubt about that. But it's not precise. It's not.
No, there must be huge learning experiences and quite horrific experiences. I don't think an ordinary person who was not trained in this kind of thing would find that an experience that they would welcome.
Well, I wasn't trained. I wasn't trained. I just went in.
One of the things which comes over from your book is the difference between kind of Hollywood and reality when it comes to these kinds of things. Can I read a bit from your book? Because it struck me as bringing some reality to the situation here. But you say you enjoyed being frightened by horror films when you were young, and most of us were. But now I experience things that might produce revulsion in even the most gruesomely minded of directors and actors. Reality is invariably more nauseating than fiction. And you say the remains of a thick pattern knitted jumper still clung to parts of the body. His T-shirt was covering much of his head, as though he'd been dragged into position. His shoes were still on his feet, although one had already been badly burned. All the remnants of clothing were soaked in body fluids, burnt or covered in bluebottle eggs and maggots. He was a sorry sight. I mean, the difference between what Hollywood presents and what reality presents is huge, isn't it?
Oh, yes, yes. I think most of the things I see in the media, most of the things, well, a lot of them are just silly, you see. It's just silly, but a lot, it's so inaccurate. Well, of course, how can you portray that? You can't. Most people wouldn't want to see it, would they?
No.
Who would want to experience that? You only have to, unless you're a bit funny in the head, you would only want to if it was for a purpose, to help in some way or to deduce something in way. The police are faced with things like that all the time. And I think people forget how, and not all police officers, some police officers, most police officers go through life not seeing anything like it at all. But those who do go through it, just think how robust they must be.
Did you have difficulty at the start? When you first began this?
Not really. No, not really. The one thing that is difficult to put up with is the smell. It is nauseating. Yeah. And the funny thing is, you go through life and you'll smell something. You think, oh, yeah, that's like 3 or 4 weeks into the decomposition process. I tell you, there is one thing that if you really want to smell one of the stages of a rotting corpse, is to smell dried cat food.
Dried cat food?
Yeah, there is dried cat food, you know, those biscuity type things. If you put your head in one of those boxes and smell, which doesn't worry me, but that is a distinct smell of one of the stages of some of the corpses I've come across. And of course, look, you're only a piece of meat, aren't you?
Yeah.
I mean, if you dried out, you might end up smelling like a bit of cat food. I mean, people forget this, that when you're dead, you'll eat a steak. What are you eating? A dead cow, a piece of meat. If you eat pork, a dead pig.
But we're brilliant, aren't we, at divorcing and siloing. You know, you go around Sainsbury's, you see chunks of meat laid out for you, and it's completely divorced in your mind from the animal that was walking around a week or so ago. And we don't have, we have to, I think, separate those two things out. Otherwise, most people would find that very difficult.
Well, why do you think I'm a vegetarian?
I didn't know you were, but that.
Oh, you know, I'll never forget going into a supermarket in Spain, and they have these huge wet fish counters, and the smell there to me was an absolute mortuary.
Wow.
I nearly vomited. I just had to go out. It was disgusting. And how people they were buying there happily and so on. And I thought, oh no, not for me. And they're dead bodies, you see. They are
Yes,
dead.
of course they are. And that, surprisingly enough, one of the things you mention in your book is that some of your worst experiences in the whole thing have been with people, other people, and the way in which having to deal with other people who are around the crime scene, so to speak. Could you say more about that? Because I know that you are quite critical at times, in a way which again reminded me of Sherlock Holmes, who said, "Look, if I'd have got here first." They wouldn't have had all these people walking around and muddying the whole setup. People have been quite a problem, is that right?
Yes, I mean, at crime scenes, definitely. I think they're a bit better now, but it still happens. They can't conceive that the position of a twig or a leaf is critical, and they don't understand that if they trample on something, they destroy something. So certainly early on, and I presume they still do, they'll trample on things, they'll move things. I had one very famous case. I'm not going to mention it because the police officer knows who he is. They
Yeah.
covered the corpse with like a tent thing and over a branch. Then they cut the branch off. When I got to that corpse, it was covered in sawdust, and all around it had been trampled.
Oh,
What a disaster,
yeah.
and that's through ignorance. But of course, also you've got the police and the forensic services and so on. I was always an outsider going in, and nobody understood really. And so I think I did, and others like me, did suffer a lot of resentment because most of them would have to be following strict protocols according to the institutionalized rules. Well, of course, I had to make things up on the hoof,
Yeah.
test things, and that often didn't go down very well, and because they didn't understand. And even some colleagues, I think there has been quite a bit of professional jealousy, to be perfectly honest, but what can you do about it?
Yeah. Have
Just
there been clashes, specific clashes with police or other professionals that you remember?
yes, yes, they have, and pathologists. Now, I have to say that most of them are absolutely fabulous. They're understanding, they're facilitating, they're really very good. But some of them very difficult indeed, very difficult.
Well, looking back, have some of the cases, which I mean, over 300 cases is a huge amount. Have any of them stood out for you as being particularly of interest or note, or something which you've been particularly proud of in the way in which you've handled it or approached it?
Well, everyone is different. Everyone teaches me something, and I have obtained something from every single one. And it's not any case that has satisfied me. It's little things within the case. Like I helped a police force measure a bone where they didn't have, it had been originally been photographed without a scale. And they desperately wanted to know the size of this because the bone person needed the size of this bone to be able to identify the bone. And I was able to do that from measuring the vegetation in the photograph, going back to the crime scene, taking a large sample of the species in question, measuring it, and then getting the average, and then extrapolating back to the photograph, and then to the bone, and we were able to measure the bone. It's things like that that have stuck in my mind. They're little techniques that have been very valuable, really. So it's no one case. I mean, some of the cases that are more interesting than others, you've never heard of, you never will hear of. But there's always some little technique that I've invented. Like there was one in Northern Ireland. It was an IRA case where someone had been shot, and someone had done it through hiding behind a derelict stone building. I had the clothing. How could we show that that person had been behind that stone building? So I scrubbed the wall. I got the wall scrubbed. I analysed the wall. I analysed the clothing. Lo and behold, they were very, very similar. You wouldn't, and of course, to get transfer of these particulates, you need contact. You really do need physical contact. And you can imagine someone behind a wall rubbing while they're doing this. Well, with a gun, it's more likely to be the right shoulder than the left. So I concentrated on the right part. I did the left as well, but concentrate. Lo and behold, matched the profile I got from the wall. So I've done the same thing with trees. Now, the other forensic scientists around me all stand looking appalled, really, that I'm scrubbing trees. But it works, you see.
How specific, though, is one tree from another?
Oh, they're all utterly different.
They are.
Oh, yes, because if you imagine, I don't know, an oak tree growing, well, the next time you go out, look at an oak tree, see what's growing near it. Then go somewhere else, look at an oak tree, see what's growing near it. Do you think they'll be identical? No, because they're both in different environments. They've got different things growing around them. They're exposed to different wind directions. They're exposed to different kinds of rain splash. They'll be different.
So when I read in the Sherlock Holmes story that Sherlock Holmes says to Dr. Watson, I can see that you've been to the post office today. And Watson says, how on earth do you know that? And he says, that soil on your shoes is particular to that particular area. He could be quite right. There are
Oh, yes,
specific,
definitely. You
definitely.
can't quite do it just by looking. I mean, basically, if it's very obvious, like the color of the soil or the particle size, which you can even see by eye, okay, but you would have to analyze it to be absolutely sure.
Do you ever look at cases which appear in the news today, which maybe you're not involved in, but you see something on the television or there's some report and you think to yourself, that can't be right, or it shouldn't be working that way, or I wish I was there because I'd have been able to do this and provide something like that. You have a critical...
Oh, yeah, I do, actually. I do. I see that quite a lot. And I think it's such a shame that perhaps they should have called me. I could have done that. And in fact, I do defense work and I've just got a case come in and I'm afraid it's a mess. It's a mess. All the opportunities have been lost. If I'd been called in, we would have had an answer. Some answer, I don't know what answer, but we would have had an answer, but they didn't, and it's a mess. And all I can do is to write a report on the failings of the investigator at the beginning of the case, because there could have been easily answers.
Yeah. There's a particular case at the moment which is causing a lot of controversy in the news about Lucy Letby, the nurse who is convicted of killing 7 babies. Do you ever think about things like that and think, well, there may be something I could have done there or that?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure with that particular case that I could have done anything, but someone with other skills might have been able to do something. I had a very similar issue. It's in that current book, actually. It's a proxy by Munchausen by proxy case. I think it's in that book, where a mother was accused of trying to kill her baby, and the baby had vomited several times, and in the milky vomit, because the baby was being fed through a tube into her stomach, there were little black dots. Well, the first time it got thrown away, the second time it got put in the fridge, and then it got lost. The third time, they decided to call in the police, and they thought that they were poppy seeds, because the father was a baker.
Right.
Well, the little black things were sent to the Forensic Science Service, and they did all sorts of complicated chemical things and couldn't work out what they were. Well, when I looked under the microscope, I realized that they weren't biological. But to check that, I checked with other colleagues. Do you think? No, it's not biological. The whole structure. And then I noticed that the little black dots in this milky vomit on a napkin had started to have a red halo around them. So something was seeping out of these little black dots. And I thought, oh, and again, this is off the top of my head, that something is probably oil soluble because the milk has got fat in it.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I got some of these little black dots. I put them in water, nothing happened.
Yeah.
I put them on an oily surface, all the red stuff came out. So it was definitely oil soluble. And when I looked at it, I tried to think what I'd have a perfectly round surface of that size. And it wasn't fungal, I checked that. And do you remember years and years ago, there was a drug called Contact something, and you used to take
Oh
it.
yes, Contact 400. It was for drying up.
Yes, yes. Well, they were
viruses.
full of little bubbles, full of
Yeah.
little bubbles, and they were time release bubbles.
Yeah.
And I thought, gosh, it might be something like that. So I told the police this. They went back to the hospital. One of the doctors says, "Oh yes, that baby was given a drug to stop reflux." The
Oh.
silly thing was that the mother, who would have been shipped off to prison, presumably, or she may have been, the one doctor had prescribed this drug and nobody else had cottoned on. And the baby was vomiting this drug. And one doctor knew about it, and it's all about bad communication. So once the police knew, the mother was exonerated. And when they looked into it further, that little baby who had been taken into care several times because of broken bones had this brittle bone disease. And that hadn't been investigated.
Yeah.
So it's things like that are quite interesting. So
Yeah.
that was a nurse doctor type thing, but you know.
There's a number of things which seem to come to light only with modern technology or new techniques. And you must have seen a lot of changes in your field as new technology comes available. Is there something which stood out for you in terms of now I've got a new technique or a new thing, and how has it changed over time? What's become more significant or more important?
Well, my discipline hasn't changed.
Oh.
My discipline hasn't changed. What has changed is this enormous emphasis and reliance on DNA and other such techniques. But I was always brought in when DNA wasn't useful, or where there were no fingerprints, and the other kinds of forensic techniques weren't useful. So I mean, DNA now, but of course it is a victim of its own success in a way because it's so sensitive. And very often now, it's not whose DNA is it, but how did it get there? Because it's easily transmitted. If I touch you and you get my DNA, you could pass that on to someone else. You could, or another object.
Yes, that's because of the sensitivity of the tests.
Oh, it's incredibly sensitive. It's wonderful, but it's incredibly sensitive. And I think the people that are becoming more and more aware, and they now, of course, they're much more aware of secondary transfer, tertiary transfer. And it's a victim of its own sensitivity, really, and the advances of the techniques. Yes.
So contamination then becomes an important issue in that area.
Contamination, yes. And, you know, when does the DNA stop being transferred?
Yeah. One of the things which also struck me from your book, which I learned, I mean, you learn a lot of things, not just about forensic ecology, but about a whole range of different subjects as you drop in lots of interesting bits of information from many different fields. But the one thing which struck me was the complexity of ecological systems, which I hadn't much thought of, and how everything seems to fit together like a very large, complicated jigsaw, and that one small change over here can produce other changes elsewhere. I didn't know, for example, that insects, flying insects, create a positive charge, and that the plants have a negative charge, so pollen is attracted across. and that it's a very simple way of gathering, but it's just a small little indication of a complex system which all works together in such a complex way. And the fact that plants don't have to distribute their pollen means that that affects them, and the way in which everything works out. The complexity is fascinating in itself and must make your job a bit harder, I would think.
Well, it's wonderful, isn't it? I mean, this is something I try to teach everybody. Nothing is simple. Everything is absolutely complicated. And they say, well, simplify, simplify. But you can't. There are things you can't simplify because they're not simple. I mean, the world is highly complex. And this is why I'm very suspicious of some mathematical modeling or modeling. I mean, some models are very, very useful, but they never have all the parameters included in them. They can't. The world is multivariate. Everything is multivariate, and you have to do your best. You
I
just have
think
to
that's
do.
something that non-scientists often get wrong, that models are not science. Models are low resolution models of a very, very complex world, and they are at the best mere approximations and depend heavily upon the parameters which you put into them in the first place.
Exactly. I wish politicians could get that.
So do I. That would be the thing.
Would be
Tell me,
wonderful.
are there any cases which you look back on which you are disappointed with? Any unsolved things? Anything which were didn't go as you would have liked them to have done? Anything which stands out in that way?
Oh, there is one, and it again. I think I've written about it in one of the books. Uh, it was where a corpse was found without a head, without hands, and
It's in this book, I think.
oh, you've read that one, have you?
I've read a lot of it, but not all of it. I've
Yes,
skipped in
yes,
because each chapter can be read independently, which is a great thing about this kind of book.
yes. Well, yes, that was, we got wonderful evidence, but the police never managed to find a perpetrator.
Yeah.
And it it just sort of fizzled out because they couldn't quite get hold of the right people that I could test them. If
Yeah.
we had got the right people, we could have tested them, and we could have said, yes, they have been to this place, they've been involved with this crime, this, you can see this, you can see that, whatever. But I think they knew who it was, but they could never quite get someone for me to test. And that was sad because we got wonderful evidence from that case. They never found the head, by the way.
That's worrying then, isn't it? Must be somewhere or other. Um,
Yeah.
we're coming to the end of our time together, and it's been a fascinating conversation, I have to say. But if there are people who want to do the same kind of work that you've been doing, and I know there were lots of people fascinated because of TV programs on CSI and those kind of things. What would you say in terms of advice to those people, and particularly what kind of temperament does a person need to have to do this kind of work? And what kind of people would you say are temperamentally unsuited to this kind of work? What personal qualifications would you really need?
Well, first of all, you have to be strong. First of all, you have to have a strong stomach. Secondly, you have to have quite a robust personality because you have to deal with people, all sorts of people, and some of them are pretty strong. And you have to say, okay, you be strong in your environment. I know what I'm doing. You have to be confident in what you're doing and be able to defend what you're doing. And of course, to go to court, you have to be able to think on your feet. You have to be brave enough and strong enough to cope with being torn to shreds by barristers. The one thing I know is they don't know as much as I know about this. So that protects me up to a point. And invariably, you get barristers who swat up. They do their best. They never quite get it right.
You ever been made to look silly in a court because barristers are so cute and clever in that kind of way, or have you always been able to rebuff them?
Well, there is one barrister who gave me a very hard time, but he's very clever. He was the junior in the Soham case, and he and I worked together closely for a long time. And I taught him so much about palynology. I really did. And he was bright and he was picking it up and he understood. Would you believe I went to a case and he was for the other side?
Uh,
And he started asking questions that he knew, that I knew there was no answer to.
yeah.
And that made life very, very difficult. It made it very, very difficult. And I thought, oh, I'll never be that open with a barrister again.
Another
Except,
lesson to learn from the
yeah, but I
experience.
have to say, there was another barrister for another nasty murder who came to my house, spent hours and hours and lots of emails, and he really got to grips with it. He was wonderful in court. He asked all the right questions. He was fabulous. He became a judge. I think he's retired now. Yes. So
Right.
the barristers vary a lot, you know. They
I'm
vary a
sure.
lot.
My last question, Patricia, you've written 2 books, Traces, and this one, The Natural History of Crime, and I understand you're working on a 3rd book. Can you tell us a little bit about that, a little peek about what that's about and how you might, when we might see something of that coming out?
Well, I suppose it'll be similar to the others in that I've got so many case histories, and some of them are so complicated and so interesting and weird that I thought I really need to write these down so people can see the sorts of things that are needed. And so I haven't given it much thought yet. I've written 1 chapter, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to write up all these cases and then put them together and then think about it. I'm lucky in a way that the editors haven't really edited very much. They don't seem to need to edit very much in or out of it. And so I shall just say, well, look, I've done this. There you are, what you want. And example, the book you've got in front of you, I'd written it, and they said, oh, we want an introduction. And I just sat down and just knocked that out, really. I mean, it's just what's in there. I'm lucky in that I don't really have to do much research because it's in my head.
Yeah. Well, I have
So
to say, this is a remarkably well-written book. I mean, I don't say that about all the books I read, but it's fascinating. It's an easy style, easy to understand. Though there are some technical terms in there, but you explain all of those. You've got little footnotes for them. And what I like about each chapter is it's independent, and also each chapter reads like its own little crime puzzle, where you start off and tell the story as, you know, the police have contacted me. This is what I find. This is what I'm looking for. This is how I go about the process. This is how I do my analysis. And then these are the results. Sometimes in one case, there wasn't any result because they didn't find the murderer. But all of it is fascinating. There are some little bywaters as you go off in each chapter, and all of them I find very interesting and very informative. So I do hope that your next book comes out soon too. I will enjoy finishing off this one, and I can recommend it to anyone. This is The Natural History of Crime, Case Studies in Death and the Clues that Nature Leaves Behind. Unputdownable in many ways. Patricia Wiltshire, sorry. What were you going to say? Go on.
I was just going to say thank you for interviewing me. It's been enjoyable.
Well, it's been a very enjoyable and fascinating conversation, and thank you very much indeed for your time. I very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.